preparing for the worst. The Surgeon General issues a stark warning to the United States about the impact of the coronavirus in the coming days. We're at the White House. The start of Holy Week. Pope Francis celebrates Palm Sunday Mass in a virtually empty St. Peter's Basilica. Addressing the nation, what the Queen of England says about the fight against COVID-19. And a deposit of kindness. Amid the deadly pandemic, a Catholic landlord in Brooklyn, New York, makes an extraordinary gesture to his tenants. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, April 6, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. The United States is bracing for a painful week. A wave of coronavirus deaths is expected across the nation. Cities like New York, New Orleans, and Detroit face an especially dire prognosis. Correspondent Owen Jensen kicks off our team coverage tonight from the White House. Owen?
Tracy, tonight here at the White House, they're asking for prayers. COVID-19 has killed more than 10,000 people here in the U.S., which leads the globe in confirmed infections.
At the White House, prayers for the nation on Palm Sunday.
We may be apart. We can use this time to turn to reflection and prayer and our own personal relationship with God.
President Donald Trump says this is an important time to pray.
I would ask that all Americans pray for the heroic doctors and nurses, for the truck drivers and grocery store workers, and for everyone fighting this battle.
With less than a week until Easter Sunday, the death toll expected to soar. One ICU doctor in New Jersey turning to prayer in her own battle with the illness that literally brought her to her knees when she couldn't breathe.
I got down on my knees and I put my forehead to the ground and I prayed to God. I prayed Psalm 91. I prayed to be under his wing and to heal me and to give me time and to let me live.
And while those on the front lines put their lives at risk, for everyone else,
this is the moment to not be going to the grocery store, not going to the pharmacy, but doing everything you can to keep your family and your friends safe.
And when you must leave home to buy food or medicine,
CDC recommends and the task force recommends wearing cloth face coverings in public settings where other social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. These include places like grocery stores and pharmacies.
And on the economic side,
we want to execute this I'll call it a rescue plan, if you will. I like to think of it as a assistance and stabilization. We want to keep people going here until we see signs that the virus is abating.
Now, the steep rise in coronavirus deaths in New York appears to be leveling off, but officials there say don't get complacent. Keep that social distancing going. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Owen. Correspondent Owen Jensen reporting from the White House tonight. The coronavirus is making even the routine act of legislating a dangerous risk. After passing the largest economic relief bill in history, lawmakers are now considering staying away from Washington for a month or even more. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports tonight from home. Eric.
Yeah, Tracy, you know, Congress is supposed to come back to Capitol Hill on April 20th, but we're hearing it could be longer than that, a month to a month and a half longer. Meanwhile, the work continues. Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer is calling on President Trump to invoke the Defense Production Act in full, and he's also calling on GOP support for the next economic relief bill.
Senator Chuck Schumer stresses the need for President Trump to fully invoke the Defense Production Act.
2 weeks ago, I called the president and asked him to use the DPA, and he said he would do it. He hollered to somebody who must have been in the Oval Office, let's invoke the DPA, and then 3 hours later he said he's not sure. I mean, use it fully and completely.
The minority leader is also nominating Bharat Ramamurthy, a former economist, for Senator Elizabeth Warren to the Congressional Oversight Commission for the pandemic response. Meanwhile, the majority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, agrees another bill is needed soon. The Kentucky Republican says the new package, quote, should be more a targeted response to what we got wrong and what we didn't do enough for. And at the top of the list, there would have to be the health care part of it. He's urging lawmakers to rely on healthcare experts for solutions to wipe out the virus. The virus has hit several members of Congress directly. Republican Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida was the first sitting congressman to test positive for the virus. He's now recovered and has even signed up to donate plasma. 45-year-old Democratic Congressman Ben McAdams of Utah spent 9 days in the hospital fighting COVID-19. Last week, he pushed for Congress to act on an additional bill.
There's no space for politics. What we have to do has to be bipartisan, and really we have to come together and work together to save lives.
Meanwhile, extra steps are being taken on Capitol Hill. According to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, even the way that representatives receive information on the Senate floor is going to change. They used to be hand delivered by staff. Now it's going to all be done electronically through a secure email. It's just a sign of the times. Tracy.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting for us tonight. Thank you again, Eric. The Prime Minister of Britain was moved to intensive care in a London hospital late this afternoon. Boris Johnson developed mild symptoms of COVID-19 10 days ago, and after a persistent fever, his doctors hospitalized him last night. A few hours ago, his symptoms worsened, and he was placed in ICU. His office says that he is conscious and does not need a ventilator. Outside of her annual Christmas message, Queen Elizabeth II has only given an address to her nation a few times in her 68 years as monarch of the United Kingdom, and last night was one of them.
I'm speaking to you at what I know is an increasingly challenging time, a time of disruption in the life of our country, a disruption that has brought grief to some, financial difficulties to many, and enormous changes to the daily lives of us all.
In her rare address to the nation, the 93-year-old Queen thanked doctors and nurses. Her speech offered words of comfort to people who are isolating themselves in their homes. Pope Francis celebrated Palm Sunday Mass yesterday in an empty St. Peter's Basilica.
Amare, pregare, perdonare, prendersi cura degli altri.
The Holy Father opened Holy Week with only a few aides and nuns who sat in the first pews and stayed several feet apart. In a normal year, tens of thousands of people would have been holding olive branches at an outdoor Mass. And in the old city of Jerusalem, Franciscan monks from the Latin parish handed out palm branches. They say it is a sign of new hope. But the traditional procession through Jerusalem was canceled. Usually palm branches are carried from the top of the Mount of Olives. Pope Francis created an emergency fund of initially $750,000 to help impacted communities run by the church in poor countries. The fund is run by the Pontifical Mission Societies, the Pope's official mission outreach. It supports over 1,000 dioceses in rural areas. Pope Francis prays for prisoners in overcrowded jails.
Tanta gente lì, c'è il pericolo in questa pandemia.
At his daily morning Mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father urged governments around the world to come up with creative solutions as many encounter a high risk of coronavirus infection. Violent riots have erupted in many prisons around the world within the last few weeks over fears of the virus. Father Brian Gowans, president of the International Commission of Catholic Prison Pastoral Care, joins us now from Kirkcaldy, Scotland. Thank you for joining us, Father.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Father, I know this is not the first time that Pope Francis prayed, especially for inmates during the pandemic. How is the coronavirus crisis? How is it affecting prisoners' lives?
Well, I suspect, like everybody else, only you can multiply it by any number you care to think of. When you're in isolation, it's difficult enough. When you're in isolation in a prison, your mind works all kinds of weird and wonderful tricks. And for some, it will be a very anxious time, I'm sure.
Are prison chaplains still able to visit the prisons during this time?
By and large, yes. Although some too are having to self-isolate, some are already showing symptoms, some will have underlying health issues, so they are not allowed in. But the ones who are hale and hearty, as we say here in Scotland, provided they keep the social distancing measures, they have protective clothing like masks and gloves, then yeah, they are allowed in, and indeed they're warmly welcomed by both the prisoners and indeed the staff.
Well, Father, I know you have almost 30 years of experience being a prison chaplain. Can you talk about the work that you do and how it's different from a diocesan priest?
Well, I think it's one of these jobs you either love it or hate it. It's what we call the Marmite job. If you hate it, you don't hang around. But most of us love it and certainly don't want to leave it. I can hear it in Pope Francis when he's speaking and in the way he acts. He's always engaging with prisoners and their families and the staff. That's because he himself, as a young priest and indeed not so young priest, worked in the prisons. He knows what it's like. It's different because you actually see the gospel come alive. It's not a book that you read, it's something you live, and you see it in the lives and the hearts of the prisoners. It's wonderful.
What do you enjoy most about it?
What I enjoy most about it is the ability to sit down and listen to someone's story. You have to be a good listener, and you have to get to know someone. And as you get to know them, you can then ask that all-important question, tell me your story. And the minute you say that, there's that little odd look, that glint of suspicion, well, understandably. But because they know you and trust you, the floodgates open and they tell you your story. And some of these stories are really fascinating.
Well, Father, thank you so much for joining us today and your insight and all that you do. Father Brian Gowans, president of the International Commission of Catholic Prison Pastoral Care.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, advice on surviving the uncertain economic times during this coronavirus pandemic. U.S. stocks surged more than 7% today. Very welcome news following Friday's disappointing job numbers as the coronavirus pandemic continues to impact the nation's economy. The U.S. Labor Department reported a loss of 701,000 jobs for the month of March, ending nearly a decade of uninterrupted job growth. Meanwhile, the nation's unemployment rate rose in March to 4.4%. Joining me now by Skype is Jay Richards, Research Assistant Professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. He is also host of Force for Good on EWTN. Jay, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Jay, let's talk about the relationship between controlling this pandemic and then stabilizing the economy. Obviously, we're in uncharted waters right now. How does this complicate economic predictions?
Well, and it's just all thrown to the wind. I mean, that's the reality. As you said, we're in uncharted territory. I mean, we've had recessions, we've had depressions, we've had shocks to the economy before. What we haven't had is a massive, almost instantaneous freezing of the economy voluntarily, because that's what's happened. And so we really just don't know exactly what's going to happen. We do know that the fundamentals of the economy are what they were a month ago. We almost hit record highs just a month and a half ago in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And a lot really depends on how long we maintain this social distancing and this massive quarantine and lockdown.
Jay, how can we tell if the government's efforts are doing enough in the short term in order to protect the economy in the long term?
Well, honestly, I think looking at what the markets do is your best bet, because the market, in Dow Jones Industrial Average, is essentially the wisdom of thousands of people that are watching what's happening. And so far, of course, the market's down over its highs, of course, but it hasn't collapsed. And I think the kind of collective wisdom of the crowd is that what the government is doing, at least in the short run, is likely to prevent the kind of catastrophe that we might have seen if there hadn't been any response at all.
We've also been hearing a lot about a recession, maybe as possibly going into a depression. What are your thoughts, and do you think this is a likely scenario?
I think recession is highly likely. I mean, the reality is that something like 2/3 of the jobs lost in the last month have been in hospitality and service sectors. Lots and lots of small businesses probably will disappear. That's where the most vulnerable part of the economy is. I don't see how we don't have a couple of quarters that are recessions, but I think really a lot depends on what happens, honestly, in the next 2 or 3 weeks. If we hit a peak in deaths and new cases of the coronavirus and are able to pick up again, I think it'll just be a couple couple of quarters, and that's really what I'm hoping for.
I want to quickly talk about the coronavirus stimulus package. You know, a lot of people are waiting to receive those stimulus checks. For most people though, that money's not going to cover all of their expenses. What would you say to those folks, and do you have any recommendations for them?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the reality is that for a lot of people, they just immediately lost their job. So getting $1,600 2 months from now is not going to make a big difference. I do know people that are doing odd jobs that are still acceptable, outside work that maybe they've never done. And so I think for people that are really hurting, they're going to have to look for something like that. I do think also local parishes and local communities need to step up. I mean, we all know colleagues, people in our parishes who maybe have jobs that were hit very severely. Some of us, like us, we're not. I'm basically doing the job that I always do. I think we need to focus on the people that we're really close to, either in our parishes or our families, and just step up and help them, because they're going to need some near-term help, I think, to get over this hump.
Absolutely, Jay. That's great advice. Thanks so much for joining us. Jay Richards, Research Assistant Professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, and also host of A Force for Good right here on EWTN. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tracy.
The governor of Wisconsin issues an executive order delaying in-person voting until June 9th for the state's presidential primary. The vote was supposed to take place tomorrow. The order comes as thousands of poll workers said they would not show up for work. A court challenge is expected. Up next, how faithful around the world can see the Shroud of Turin this weekend. And a landlord in Brooklyn uses his Catholic faith to make an extraordinary gesture to his tenants. We'll explain. Catholics around the world will be able to see a live stream of the Shroud of Turin Saturday. For centuries, the shroud has been venerated as the burial cloth of Christ. The Archbishop of Turin will preside over the liturgy in front of the shroud. And for more on the story, including why it is so rare for the shroud to be displayed in public, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Celebrating Holy Week in the midst of the pandemic is creating a challenge for clergy and their flock. But while the public celebration of Mass is off limits for most Catholics around the world, there are ways for the faithful to observe Holy Week. Joining me now is Father Dominic Legg, director of the Thomistic Institute. Father, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
It's great to be with you.
So, Father, how should we as Catholics approach this Holy Week? And also, how can we use this special time to help to deepen our faith?
Well, you know, Holy Week is a privileged time, and the liturgy is wonderfully, wonderfully rich. That's why it's particularly painful for many of us, I would say not only the laity, but also priests, I can speak for myself, when we are celebrating the liturgy and we have to do it in a kind of empty church. But that doesn't mean that everyone at home is deprived of the liturgy. Of course, you can watch something on a live stream. You can also pray along with the liturgy, and I think that's a great way to do it, to actually read the liturgical texts and pray with them at home, make an act of spiritual communion, and do your best to live out the rhythm of the Church's liturgy from your own home.
I know the Thomistic Institute has been offering what you're calling quarantine lectures. What do you hope the faithful will take away from these discussions?
So we actually have two different programs running right now. One is the quarantine lectures, which are like our regular programming. We put on lectures on college campuses around the country. Obviously, we can't do that in person now. All of our students are scattered around the country, but we're bringing live lectures to them every, well, right now, Tuesday, Thursdays, we're ramping up so that we're doing it more frequently. This week, every night of the week, we have some live programming. And that is just a way to engage the mind on higher things. Think about God, not necessarily things that are focused on the threats we face from the pandemic. But the other thing we're doing is putting on a Holy Week retreat, which starts on Thursday. So we'll have 2 retreat conferences and prayers that people can pray from home to follow the retreat from your own home.
I know in the midst of this pandemic, a lot of Catholics are asking some important questions, such as why does God allow evil in our lives? How can you help modern people in the middle of this pandemic find answers that are rooted in the timeless teachings of the Church?
Well, you know, actually, we're going to have a conference on that on Wednesday at 8 p.m. So the title of the talk is the coronavirus a punishment from God? That's the question that, it's a very difficult theological question to take up, but it's actually the question that everybody is emailing us to ask. So we thought that it was very important, even though it's difficult, to say something about it. I mean, the bottom line is sin and death death and illness are punishments from sin. We learn that from the book of Genesis, and we learn that also from the dogmatic teaching of the church. So in a broad sense, we can say that our vulnerability to sin, our vulnerability to death and to sickness is in fact a result of our sin. And it's a kind of punishment that God permits us to receive. And why does he allow us to do that, to receive that punishment? It's because he wants us to see that there is something above, something greater, and in fact, that's the eternal life that he promises, that Christ brings to us, who assumed our punishment in order to turn it into the life of the resurrection.
Well, Father, thank you so much for joining us and for your insight. Father Dominic Legg, thanks again.
Thank you.
And a reminder, EWTN airs Masses throughout the day. Mass airs at 8 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. Eastern from Our Lady of Angels Chapel in Irondale, Alabama. We are also airing the Pope's Daily Mass and a novena from Our Lady of Lourdes. In addition, we are offering Eucharistic adoration from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. on our website, EWTN.com. And finally, tonight, a landlord in Brooklyn, New York is crediting his Catholic faith on his decision to waive rent this month for his 200 tenants amid the coronavirus outbreak. EWTN News correspondent Colin Flynn reports.
I told them not to worry, not to panic. We're going through some very tough times with this monster disease. I will waive all the rent for the month of April. I took care of you, young lady. Keep that mask on. Come on, let's go. Paulino.
This is Salerno Auto Body Shop in Brooklyn.
Would you like a donut? I'm good.
And the man in charge is Mario Salerno.
I run a mechanic shop, gas station, and an auto body shop. My dad was here since 1959. This is Williamsburg, where I was born.
Not only does Mario have this garage here in Williamsburg, but he also owns a lot of properties.
I have 80 apartments. I have quite several buildings, close to 200 tenants.
You built up quite an empire.
Yes, I built these with my own hands, and you know.
And recognizing that so many of his tenants had been hit financially because of the coronavirus, he decided to waive the rent for the month of April. Mario, what made you decide to waive the rent for all your 200 tenants?
Because I had a lot of my tenants losing their jobs. I wanted them to have some peace of mind, not to worry about where their next dollar was. As a human, I felt a lot more comfortable making sure that they had food on their table, which several of them didn't, and I felt very honored to tell them that.
But presumably you're taking a hard hit on this financially. How much are you losing?
We don't want to really bring that issue up. That's irrelevant to the value of a human life, and which I value people's lives. I left a big sign right here on the door. I told, very important, all the tenants, stay safe, help your neighbors, and wash your hands.
Most of his tenants are young, and many have recently lost their jobs.
It was really wonderful, and I really needed it, and it's helping me, and it's going to make it a lot easier and a lot better. I'm a lot less stressed out.
Mario is like one of the genuinely nicest people I've ever met.
Is it a help at a time like this?
For everybody.
For everybody, yeah.
This is the main office. This is where I have my shrine and where I pray. And when I come across tough difficulties, I ask the good Lord.
Mario has a strong faith and says that it helps guide the decisions he makes in life. What is it about you, about your faith, that makes you want to help?
My Catholic faith brought it upon me to make this decision. The value of a life. And I pray every day, and when I have extra time, when I'm in quarantine, I pray and I ask the good Lord to please conquer this vicious virus. I don't really look at it as being a hero. I look at it as being a human. So if I could make it easier on someone's life, just pass it on. Put it back to work from one day. She lives in my other building right there.
Mario's selfless act as a landlord is sure to hit him financially, but he says if it helps his tenants, he really doesn't mind. It's a kind act, and for many, needed now more than ever. In Brooklyn, New York, Colin Flynn for EWTN News Nightly.
Beautiful story. Thank you, Colin. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.